The sound of a rifle being cocked echoed through the stillness of the barn, stopping Fiona Taylor dead in her tracks. She'd thought she was alone in the weathered structure, having slipped in under cover of darkness to escape the howling Wyoming wind and the demons that chased her across the frontier. "Best you explain yourself before I decide you're just another thief come to steal what little I got," a deep voice drawled from the shadows. Fiona pressed herself against the rough wooden wall, her heart hammering against her bruised ribs. Pain shot through her side as she struggled to catch her breath. The lantern light finally revealed her intruder, tall, broad-shouldered, with a weathered face that had seen its share of hardship. His eyes, though hard as flint, widened slightly at the sight of her. "I ain't stealing," she whispered, voice cracking from thirst and fear. "Just needed shelter for the night." The man stepped forward, lowering his rifle slightly but not completely. As the light cast across her face, his expression changed. His gaze traveled over her split lip, the darkening bruise along her jaw, the way she cradled her left arm protectively against her body. "Those bruises tell me you need more than shelter," he said quietly, the gruffness in his voice softening just enough to make Fiona tremble with something other than fear. It was 1878 in Sweetwater County, Wyoming territory. Jackson Mitchell had spent 6 years building his small ranch from nothing after returning from the war, fighting the elements and his own demons. He'd come to prefer the company of his horses and cattle to people, but something about the wounded bird who'd flown into his barn stirred forgotten instincts. "I'll be gone by morning," Fiona said, trying to stand taller despite the pain that threatened to double her over. Jackson studied her for a long moment before sighing. "Night's getting colder. House is warmer than this barn." He gestured toward the door with his chin. "Can't promise much, but I got food and a fire." Fiona hesitated. Men's promises had brought her nothing but pain. "Why would you help me?" A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Because my ma would haunt me till the day I died if I left a wounded woman in my barn." He set the rifle aside, a peace offering. "Name's Jackson Mitchell. This is my spread." "Fiona," she replied, deliberately omitting her surname. "Fiona Taylor." "Well, Miss Taylor, I reckon whatever you're running from will still be there come morning. Might as well face it with a full stomach." Her stomach growled in response, betraying her. It had been nearly 2 days since she'd eaten properly. Cautiously, she stepped away from the wall, wincing as her body protested the movement. Jackson's eyes narrowed at her obvious pain. "Need help walking?" "No," she answered too quickly. The thought of a man's hands on her, even in assistance, made her skin crawl. "I can manage." He nodded, respecting her space. "This way, then." The walk to the modest cabin seemed endless. Each step sent pain shooting through Fiona's ribs, but she refused to show weakness. The single-story structure wasn't much weathered boards patched in places, a stone chimney with smoke curling from it against the night sky, but it represented safety she hadn't known in months. Inside, the cabin was surprisingly tidy. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting warmth across simple furnishings. A table with 2 chairs, a small kitchen area, a bed in the corner separated by a thin curtain for privacy. Everything was worn, but clean. "Sit," Jackson instructed, gesturing to a chair at the table. "Got some stew still warm." Fiona eased herself into the chair, watching warily as he moved to the iron stove. His movements were efficient, practiced. He didn't speak as he ladled stew into a bowl, cut a thick slice of bread, and placed both before her with a cup of coffee. "Eat," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "Then we can talk about those bruises." She wanted to resist, to maintain her guard, but the aroma of the stew broke her resolve. Fiona ate slowly at first, then with increasing hunger, as her body reminded her how desperately it needed nourishment. Jackson watched her without comment, his own coffee untouched. In the firelight, she could see him more clearly, mid-30s perhaps, with streaks of silver at his temples, despite his relatively young age. His face was tanned and weathered from sun and wind, but his eyes held an unexpected gentleness. "Thank you," she said finally, setting down her spoon. "I haven't eaten like that in some time." "Figured as much." He leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You running from the law?" "No." Her answer was firm. "Husband, then?" Her silence was answer enough. Jackson nodded, as if confirming something to himself. "Well, Whoever put those marks on you won't find you here tonight." "You don't know that," Fiona whispered, fear creeping back into her voice. "Frank has connections in town. People who help him." "Frank Taylor?" Jackson's jaw tightened. She nodded, regretting immediately that she'd given away too much. "The shopkeeper in Sweetwater? Built himself a fancy house on the edge of town last year?" "Yes," she admitted. "My husband." Jackson's expression darkened. "Met him once. Didn't take to him." He paused. "Town's 20 miles from here. Nobody comes out this way unless they're looking for me specifically, and not many do that." "You live alone?" Fiona asked, glancing around the cabin. "Just me and the livestock." He sipped his coffee. "Prefer it that way most days." Fiona understood solitude. Even surrounded by people in town, she'd been alone. Frank had made sure of that, cutting her off from anyone who might offer friendship or aid. "I can't stay," she said finally. "He'll look for me." "Where were you heading?" "Denver. My cousin's there." Jackson nodded thoughtfully. "That's a fair piece from here. Especially on foot." "I had a horse," she explained, "but it went lame about 5 miles back. I had to leave it." The memory brought fresh tears to her eyes, another failure in her desperate bid for freedom. "Rest tonight," Jackson said quietly. "Tomorrow, we'll figure something out." "Why would you help me?" Fiona asked again, needing to understand. Jackson was silent for a long moment, eyes fixed on something beyond the cabin walls. "Had a sister once, Clara. Her husband was a mean drunk. She wrote to me about leaving him, but before I could get to her..." He trailed off, the memory clearly painful. Some things a man can't stand by and watch happen twice. The simple truth in his words touched something in Fiona. For the first time in years, she felt a tiny spark of hope. "You can take the bed," he said, standing. "I'll sleep by the fire." "I couldn't." "You can and you will," he interrupted firmly. "Those ribs need proper rest." He moved to a trunk near the hearth and pulled out a clean shirt and a pair of worn trousers. "These will be too big, but they're clean. There's water in the pitcher by the bed if you want to wash up." The consideration nearly broke her. Frank had never once thought of her comfort, not even in the beginning, when he was still pretending to be a gentleman. "Thank you," she managed, taking the offered clothes. Jackson nodded. "I'll step outside while you change. Need to check on the horses anyway." Once alone, Fiona moved slowly to the small washstand. The face that looked back at her from the small mirror was barely recognizable hollow-eyed, with a yellowing bruise on her cheekbone and a split lip that was still healing. She touched her reflection gently, wondering when she had become this haunted creature. The cool water felt heavenly against her skin as she washed away the dust of travel and the lingering touch of Frank's anger. Jackson's shirt enveloped her like a tent, but the clean cotton was softer than anything she'd worn in months. She left her torn, dirty dress folded neatly on a chair, uncertain what to do with it. When Jackson returned, he'd removed his coat and boots, looking somewhat less imposing in his shirt sleeves. He'd also brought in extra blankets, which he arranged near the hearth. "Should be comfortable enough," he said, nodding toward the bed. "If you need anything in the night, just say so." Fiona perched on the edge of the bed, suddenly awkward. "Mr. Mitchell." "Jackson," he corrected. "Jackson," she repeated. "I don't know how to thank you." He shook his head. "No need. Get some rest, Miss Taylor." "Fiona," she offered. "Please." A small smile touched his lips. "Fiona, then." "Good night." "Good night," she whispered, sliding beneath the blankets. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded Fiona at first. The strangeness of the cabin, the presence of a man, even one who had shown her nothing but kindness, kept her senses alert. But eventually, the warmth of the bed and the quiet sounds of Jackson's steady breathing lulled her into the deepest sleep she'd known in years. When she woke, sunlight was streaming through the cabin's single window. For a disorienting moment, Fiona couldn't remember where she was. Then the events of the previous night came rushing back, along with the pain in her ribs and the dull ache of her other bruises. The cabin was empty, but a fire still burned in the hearth. On the table sat a covered plate and a note written in a surprisingly neat hand. "Gone to check fences. Back by noon. Eat." Fiona found herself smiling at the simple command. The plate contained biscuits, still slightly warm, and a jar of honey. After eating, she dressed in her own clothes, wincing at how filthy they felt against her freshly washed skin. Outside, the day was clear and crisp, the vast Wyoming landscape stretching endlessly under a brilliant blue sky. The ranch was modest, a small barn, a corral with several horses, a chicken coop, and what appeared to be a workshop of some kind. Beyond the immediate buildings, cattle grazed on rolling grassland bordered by distant mountains. Fiona stood on the porch, breathing in the clean air, feeling momentarily free. Then reality intruded. Frank would be looking for her. He wouldn't stop until he found her. She needed to keep moving. She was debating whether to leave a thank you note and continue her journey when she spotted a rider approaching from the east. Fear clutched at her heart until she recognized Jackson's broad shoulders and the distinctive coloring of his chestnut horse. He rode into the yard and dismounted with the easy grace of a man who'd spent his life on horseback. "Morning," he called, removing his hat. "You're up and about. That's good." "I should be going," Fiona said, wrapping her arms around herself. "I've imposed enough." Jackson studied her, his expression unreadable. "Had a thought while I was riding fence," he said, leading his horse to the water trough. "Stage comes through Willow Creek tomorrow. That's just 10 miles west of here. Could get you passage to Laramie, then on to Denver." Hope fluttered in Fiona's chest. "I have some money," she said quickly. "Not much, but enough for a ticket." "Good." He removed the saddle from his horse, his movements practiced and efficient. "One problem, though. Your husband might have men watching the stage stops." Fiona's hope deflated as quickly as it had risen. "You're right. He knows I have family in Denver. It would be the first place he'd look." Jackson set the saddle on the corral fence and turned to face her. "Got another proposition for you." "What kind of proposition?" Fiona asked, wariness creeping into her voice. "Honest one," he assured her, seeming to understand her concern. "I need help around here. Places more than one man can handle properly. Could use someone to cook, tend the garden, help with the horses." He gestured to the ranch. "It's not much, but it's quiet. Off the main roads. Nobody comes looking." Fiona stared at him, speechless. "You're offering me work?" "Room and board, plus wages," he confirmed. "Stay the winter at least. By spring, your husband might have given up looking. Or you might have figured out somewhere else to go." "Why would you do that?" The question that seemed to keep coming back. Jackson shrugged, looking almost uncomfortable. "Told you, need the help." He paused. "And maybe I wouldn't mind the company. Gets quiet out here." Fiona considered his offer. Logic told her to keep running, to get as far from Wyoming territory as possible. But instinct, something she'd learned to trust during her years with Franks, told her Jackson Mitchell was a man of his word. "I can cook," she said finally. "And I'm good with a garden, not so much with horses." A smile, the first real one she'd seen from him, transformed his face. "I'll teach you about the horses. Rest you already know." "If Frank finds me here, you could be in danger," she warned. The smile disappeared. "Let me worry about Frank Taylor." That night, after a simple but satisfying dinner that Fiona insisted on cooking, they sat at the table making plans. Jackson produced paper and pencil, sketching a rough map of the ranch and surrounding area. "Property runs about 3 miles that way," he explained, pointing. "Creek forms the western boundary. North and east border Simmons Place, but Old Man Simmons rarely comes this far out. South is open range." "It's beautiful land," Fiona observed. "Hard land," Jackson corrected, "but fair if you treat it right." He tapped the pencil on the cabin. "Been thinking of adding on another room come spring. Place was only built for one, but won't be hard to expand." The casual mention of permanence, of a future beyond mere survival, caught Fiona off guard. How long had it been since she'd thought beyond the next day, the next hour? "Tomorrow we'll ride into Willow Creek," Jackson continued. "Need supplies anyway. You should have proper clothes, things of your own." "I can't let you spend money on me," Fiona protested. "Consider it an advance on your wages." His tone brooked no argument. "Besides, can't have you working in that torn dress. People might get the wrong idea about how I treat my help." The thought of new clothes that weren't chosen by Frank, that didn't bear the marks of his anger, was overwhelming. "Thank you," she whispered, Jackson nodded, seemingly uncomfortable with her gratitude. "We should leave at first light. It's market day in Willow Creek. More people around means less chance of standing out." That night, despite Jackson's protests, Fiona insisted on sleeping by the fire, giving him back his bed. "You've worked all day," she argued. "I've done nothing but rest." He relented, but only after making sure she had enough blankets and a proper pillow. As she settled onto the pallet near the hearth, Fiona realized it was the first time in years that a man had considered her comfort without expecting something in return. Sleep came easier that night, the crackling fire and Jackson's steady breathing creating a cocoon of safety she'd almost forgotten could exist. Morning brought a pale pink sunrise and a biting chill. Fiona woke to find Jackson already dressed and preparing coffee, moving quietly so as not to disturb her. "Sorry," she said, embarrassed to be caught still sleeping. "I should have been up helping." "Sun's barely up," he replied. "Plenty of time." He poured her a cup of coffee, strong and black. "Thought we'd take the wagon, easier for bringing back supplies." The ride to Willow Creek took just over 2 hours, the wagon rumbling over rutted trails that barely qualified as roads. Jackson pointed out landmarks as they traveled a lightning-struck tree that marked the turn to the eastern pasture, a distinctive rock formation that local Indians believed held spiritual significance, the creek that gave Willow Creek its name. Fiona drank in the information, along with the spectacular scenery. Growing up in St. Louis, then living in Sweetwater after marrying Frank, she'd never experienced such vast open spaces. The endless sky and rolling land created a sense of possibility that had been missing from her life for too long. Willow Creek proved to be little more than a cluster of buildings where several trails converged: a general store, a saloon, a small hotel, and a handful of houses. But compared to Jackson's isolated ranch, it felt bustling. "Remember," Jackson said quietly as he helped her down from the wagon, "you're my cousin from back east, come to help with the ranch after losing your husband." They'd crafted the story carefully the night before, close enough to truth to be convincing, different enough to protect her. Fiona touched the bruises on her face, now fading to yellowish green. "Will they believe it?" "Folks around here mind their business," Jackson assured her, "but better to have a story ready than invite questions." The general store was run by a stout woman named Mrs. Winters, whose sharp eyes missed nothing but whose mouth stayed mercifully closed about what she observed. She helped Fiona select sturdy work dresses, a warmer coat, proper boots, and the other necessities a woman would need. "Your cousin's got good taste, Mr. Mitchell," Mrs. Winters commented as she wrapped Fiona's purchases. "Not like some of these city girls who come out west expecting to wear silks and satins." "She's practical," Jackson agreed, paying for the items without batting an eye at the cost. "Knows what ranch life requires." While Mrs. Winters finished with their order, Jackson stepped outside to speak with a man delivering mail. Through the window, Fiona watched their interaction. Jackson's normally reserved expression animated as he conversed with the mail carrier. "That's Thomas Burke," Mrs. Winters explained, following Fiona's gaze. "Carries mail between here and Laramie. Good man. Lost his wife in childbirth last year. Been raising his boy alone." She gave Fiona a sidelong glance. "Your cousin's not spoken more than 10 words to anyone in town for years. Good to see him talking." Before Fiona could respond, Jackson returned, his expression carefully neutral once more. "Ready?" he asked, gathering their packages. The ride back to the ranch was quieter, both lost in their own thoughts. The sun was setting by the time they arrived, painting the landscape in hues of gold and crimson. "It's so beautiful here," Fiona murmured as Jackson helped her down from the wagon. "Gets in your blood," he agreed, his hand lingering on her waist a moment longer than necessary. "The land, I mean." That evening, wearing one of her new dresses, a simple blue cotton that Mrs. Winters had promised would bring out her eyes, Fiona felt almost like herself again, the woman who had existed before Frank Taylor, before the fear and pain became her constant companions. Over the next week, they settled into a routine. Fiona took over the cooking and household tasks, freeing Jackson to focus on the more demanding ranch work. She discovered a neglected garden plot behind the cabin and set about reclaiming it, planning what she would plant come spring. Jackson, true to his word, began teaching her about the horses, his gentle, patient manner with the animals revealed a tenderness that contradicted his otherwise reserved demeanor. Under his guidance, Fiona learned to brush down the mare he assigned to her, to check her hooves for stones, to saddle and bridle her properly. "She's yours while you're here," he told her, patting the dappled gray's neck. "Daisy's steady, won't spook or throw you." "I can't accept." "Need you mobile," he interrupted. "Can't always be around to drive you if you need to go somewhere." The simple practicality of his gift touched Fiona more deeply than any expensive trinket Frank had ever given her to make up for his cruelty. As October gave way to November, the days grew shorter and the nights colder. They worked together to prepare the ranch for winter chopping and stacking firewood, repairing places where the wind whistled through the cabin walls, smoking meat and storing vegetables. One evening, as the first snow fell outside, Jackson surprised her by producing a worn chessboard after dinner. "Used to play with my pa," he explained, setting up the pieces. "Thought maybe you'd like to learn." Fiona found herself smiling at his slightly awkward invitation. "I'd like that." Their chess games became a nightly ritual, accompanied by cups of coffee or occasionally a small measure of whiskey. Over the checkered board, conversation came more easily. Jackson spoke of his time in the war, of coming west afterward to escape memories that haunted him. Fiona shared stories of her childhood in St. Louis, carefully avoiding any mention of her life with Frank. But the specter of her husband lingered between them, unacknowledged but ever present. It was during the first major snowstorm in late November that Fiona finally spoke of it. Trapped inside by howling winds and blinding snow, they had spent the day in domestic tasks, Jackson repairing tack, while Fiona mended clothes. The enforced closeness created an intimacy neither had anticipated. "He wasn't always cruel," she said suddenly, breaking a comfortable silence. "Frank, I mean." Jackson's hands stilled on the leather he was working. "No? No." Fiona continued stitching, eyes fixed on her work. "When we first met, he was charming, attentive. I was 19, working in my father's bookshop. Frank would come in every week, order books from back east. He seemed so worldly, so different from the boys I knew." Jackson remained silent, allowing her the space to continue. "We married after 6 months. My parents were against it. They thought he was too old for me, too controlling. But I was in love." A bitter smile touched her lips. "Or what I thought was love." "When did it change?" Jackson asked quietly. "Gradually. First it was little things criticizing my cooking, my appearance, then controlling who I saw, where I went." Her needle moved rhythmically, punctuating her words. "The first time he hit me was a year after we moved to Sweetwater. I dropped a plate, an expensive one, part of a set his mother had given us." Jackson's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. He apologized after, cried, brought me flowers. Fiona's hands trembled slightly. "I believed him when he said it wouldn't happen again, but it did. Yes, worse each time." She finally looked up, meeting his gaze. "The night I left, he found letters I'd written to my cousin. I never sent them, they were just a way to express my feelings. But they talked about leaving him. Her voice faltered. "He said he'd kill me before he'd let me go." Jackson set aside his work and moved to sit beside her on the small sofa. He didn't touch her, but his presence offered silent support. "I waited until he passed out drunk, took what money I could find, and ran." Tears filled her eyes. "I was so afraid he'd catch me before I made it out of town. Every sound, every shadow." "You're safe now," Jackson said, his voice rough with emotion. "Am I?" Fiona asked, finally allowing the fear she'd been holding at bay to surface. "He won't stop looking, Jackson, not until he finds me. Then he'll have to come through me." The simple declaration held no bravado, only quiet certainty. Something shifted between them in that moment, an acknowledgement that what had begun as temporary shelter had become something more. Neither named it, but both felt the change. That night, for the first time, Jackson took her hand as they sat by the fire. His calloused fingers enveloped hers with gentle strength. They remained that way for hours, connected by that simple touch. Watching the flames dance as the storm raged outside. December arrived with biting cold and pristine beauty. The ranch, blanketed in snow, took on an almost magical quality. Despite the harsh conditions, Fiona found herself happier than she had been in years. The work was hard but satisfying, the isolation peaceful rather than threatening. Jackson, too, seemed transformed. The lines of tension that had marked his face when she first arrived had softened. He smiled more readily, laughed occasionally, a rich, deep sound that warmed Fiona more effectively than any fire. They celebrated Christmas quietly. Jackson surprised her with a pair of leather gloves lined with rabbit fur, perfectly sized for her smaller hands. "To keep you warm when we're working with the horses," he explained almost shyly. Fiona's gift to him was a scarf she had knitted secretly during the long evenings, using wool Mrs. Winters had helped her select on their last trip to Willow Creek. "So you won't catch your death when you're out checking fences," she told him, watching with pleasure as he immediately wrapped it around his neck. That night, standing in the doorway before retiring to their separate sleeping areas, Jackson hesitated, then bent to press a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Merry Christmas, Fiona," he murmured. "Merry Christmas, Jackson," she whispered back, her heart racing at the tender gesture. January brought the harshest weather of the winter. For days they were confined to the cabin, venturing out only to tend the animals in the barn. The close quarters might have bred contempt, but instead they found a comfortable rhythm, moving around each other with increasing familiarity. It was during one such snowbound evening that Fiona discovered Jackson's hidden talent. Rummaging through a trunk in search of more yarn, she found a small, worn sketch pad filled with drawings, landscapes, animals, and a few portraits of people she didn't recognize. "These are beautiful," she said, carefully turning the pages. "I didn't know you could draw." Jackson, stoking the fire, looked up with surprise that quickly turned to embarrassment. "Just something I do to pass the time," he said, moving to take the sketch pad from her. "No, please," Fiona held on to it. "They're truly wonderful, Jackson. You have a gift." The sincerity in her voice stopped him. "My mother taught me," he admitted. "She was an artist, or wanted to be. Married my father and moved west instead." "Did she regret it?" Fiona asked, studying a particularly evocative sketch of a thunderstorm rolling across the plains. "Said she found different beauty here." He took the pad gently from her hands, flipping to the back where a loose sheet was tucked. This was hers. The drawing took Fiona's breath away, a young woman with Jackson's eyes, standing beside a tall, serious-looking man, a baby in her arms. The love with which it was rendered was palpable. "Your family," she said softly. "Before the war, before cholera took my mother and sister." He returned the sketch to its place. "Father followed a few years later. Heart just gave out." Fiona touched his arm gently. "I'm sorry." He covered her hand with his. "Long time ago now." That night, Fiona couldn't sleep. The revelation of this hidden side of Jackson had stirred something in her, a longing she'd thought beaten out of her by Frank's cruelty. Rising quietly, she moved to the window, watching moonlight create blue shadows on the snow. "Can't sleep?" Jackson's voice came softly from his bed. "Just thinking," she replied, not turning around. She heard him rise, felt his presence behind her before he spoke again. "About what?" "How strange life is," she said quietly. 6 months ago, I thought my future was nothing but fear and pain. Now I'm here, and everything is different." "Good different?" he asked, his voice closer now. Fiona turned to face him. In the moonlight, his features were softened, vulnerable. "Yes," she whispered, "good different." His hand reached up to brush a strand of hair from her face, the touch feather light. "Fiona," he began, then stopped, seemingly at a loss for words. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly. When she opened them, he was watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I should go back to bed," she murmured, though she made no move to step away. "Yes," he agreed, equally motionless. The moment stretched between them, taut with unspoken feelings. Then, with a gentleness that brought tears to her eyes, Jackson bent and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was tentative at first, a question more than a demand. When Fiona responded, her hands coming up to rest on his chest, it deepened into something more, a promise, a beginning. When they finally parted, Jackson rested his forehead against hers. "Been wanting to do that for weeks," he confessed. "Why didn't you?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Wasn't sure you were ready, after everything you've been through." He drew back slightly to look at her. Still not sure. Fiona considered his words, appreciating his honesty and concern. "I don't know if I am either," she admitted. "But I know I feel safe with you, Jackson." "That's something I haven't felt in a very long time." He nodded, accepting her truth without pressing for more. "That's enough for now." He brushed his thumb gently over her cheek. "We have time." As February melted into March, their relationship deepened, each day building on the foundation of trust they had established. The kisses became more frequent, more assured. Though Jackson never pushed for more than Fiona was ready to give, they began planning for spring, which fields to plant, which cattle to sell, whether to expand the chicken coop. These conversations about the future carefully avoided the question of Fiona's eventual departure, a possibility that grew more painful to contemplate with each passing day. It was during the first real thaw, when patches of ground began appearing through the melting snow, that reality intruded on their carefully constructed world. Jackson had ridden to Willow Creek for supplies, leaving Fiona to tend to the horses and prepare for the spring planting. She was in the garden, turning over soil that had been frozen for months, when she heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Expecting Jackson, she looked up with a smile that quickly died when she saw not one rider, but three, none of them the man she'd been waiting for. Panic flooded her system as she recognized the lead rider, Sheriff Donovan from Sweetwater, a man firmly in Frank Taylor's pocket. Behind him rode two men she didn't know, rough-looking characters whose expressions sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the lingering winter air. Fiona dropped her garden tools and ran for the cabin, reaching it just as the riders entered the yard. Her hands shook as she fumbled with the door, finally managing to get inside and slide the bolt home. Jackson kept a rifle above the fireplace. She'd never fired one, but had watched him clean it enough times to understand the basic operation. With trembling fingers, she lifted it down and checked that it was loaded, just as Jackson had taught her. A heavy knock rattled the door. "Mrs. Taylor," Sheriff Donovan's voice called. "I know you're in there. Your husband's mighty worried about you." Fiona remained silent, the rifle clutched to her chest. "No need to make this difficult," the sheriff continued. "Mr. Taylor just wants you to come home. Says he forgives you for running off." A bitter laugh escaped Fiona's throat. Forgiveness was the last thing Frank Taylor had in mind. "We can do this easy or hard," the sheriff called, his voice taking on an edge. "But you're coming with us either way." "Go back to Sweetwater," Fiona finally responded, her voice stronger than she felt. "Tell Frank I'm not his property." A new voice spoke then, lower and more threatening. "Lady, we ain't leaving without you. Taylor's paying good money to get his wife back. And he doesn't care what condition she's in," the third man added with a chuckle that made Fiona's blood run cold. She heard them conferring outside, then footsteps as they circled the cabin. Panic threatened to overwhelm her as she realized they were looking for another way in. The windows were small, but not impassable for a determined man. Where was Jackson? He shouldn't be back for hours yet. By then, it might be too late. A crash from the back of the cabin told her they'd found the small window in the area Jackson used as a washroom. Glass shattered, and a moment later, she heard the sound of a body forcing its way through the opening. Fiona raised the rifle, pointing it toward the curtain that separated the sleeping area from the main room. "I'll shoot," she called out, trying to keep her voice steady. "No, you won't," came the reply, and one of the unknown men pushed through the curtain, a nasty grin on his face. "Women don't have the stomach for it." He took a step toward her, and Fiona pulled the trigger. The rifle's recoil slammed into her shoulder, nearly knocking her off her feet. The man howled, clutching his arm where the bullet had grazed him. "Bitch shot me!" he yelled, stumbling backward. The commotion brought the sheriff bursting through the front door, which the third man had apparently been working on while she was distracted. Donovan had his gun drawn, his face flushed with anger. "Drop the rifle," he ordered. "Now, Mrs. Taylor." Fiona's arms ached from holding the heavy weapon, but she kept it leveled at the men. "I'm not going back to him," she said, her voice breaking. "I'll die first." "That can be arranged," snarled the wounded man, drawing a knife from his boot. "Enough, Reeves," the sheriff snapped. "Taylor wants her alive." He turned back to Fiona. "Be reasonable, Mrs. Taylor. Your husband's a prominent man. He can make things very difficult for anyone who helps you. including that rancher you've been shacking up with. Fear for Jackson squeezed Fiona's heart. Leave him out of this. A cold smile crossed Donovan's face. Too late for that. Taylor knows all about Mitchell, says he'll see him hang for stealing his wife. I wasn't stolen, Fiona protested. I left of my own free will. Not how your husband tells it, the third man said, moving to flank her from the side. Says Mitchell kidnapped you, forced himself on you. That's a lie! Fury replaced fear, making Fiona's hand steady on the rifle. Jackson's twice the man Frank is. Save it for the judge, Donovan said dismissively. Now, put down the gun before someone gets seriously hurt. The standoff might have continued indefinitely if not for the sound of a horse galloping into the yard. All heads turned toward the door. Mitchell's back, the wounded man said nervously. Good, the sheriff replied, his gun still trained on Fiona. Saves us having to track him down later. What happened next unfolded so quickly that Fiona would later struggle to recall the exact sequence. The door burst open, revealing not Jackson, but Thomas Burke, the mail carrier they'd met in Willow Creek. Fiona, get down, he shouted, and she instinctively dropped to the floor as gunfire erupted in the small cabin. When she dared to look up, the sheriff was on the ground, clutching his leg and cursing. The wounded man lay motionless near the curtain, and the third man had his hands raised in surrender, Burke's shotgun pointed at his chest. You all right, madam? Burke asked, not taking his eyes off his prisoner. Yes, Fiona managed, though her whole body was shaking. But how? Mitchell and I crossed paths in town, Burke explained. He got word Taylor's men were looking for you. Sent me ahead while he went for the marshal in Laramie. Relief flooded through Fiona, followed quickly by renewed fear. Frank will just send more men. Or come himself. Not this time, Burke said grimly. Marshall's been investigating Taylor for months. Seems your husband's been running more than just a general store. Smuggling, fraud, maybe worse. The third man's face paled at this news. I didn't know nothing about that, he protested. Taylor just hired us to bring back his wife. Tell it to the marshal, Burke suggested coldly. The next few hours passed in a blur. Burke helped Fiona bind the sheriff's wound and secure both him and the unhurt hired man. The other man hadn't survived Burke's shotgun blast. They moved the body to the barn, covering it with a tarp until authorities could deal with it properly. It was nearly sunset when Fiona heard horses approaching again. This time, she recognized Jackson's tall figure immediately, accompanied by an older man wearing a marshal's badge. Jackson dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, striding toward her with naked concern on his face. Fiona, he breathed, pulling her into his arms. Burke got here in time? Yes, she assured him, clinging to him as reaction set in. I'm all right. We're both all right. Marshal Harrison proved to be a taciturn but fair-minded man. He questioned Fiona at length about her marriage to Frank Taylor, making careful notes as she described the abuse she'd suffered. When she faltered, Jackson's steady presence beside her gave her strength to continue. Taylor's finished, the marshal said finally, closing his notebook. Between your testimony and what we've uncovered about his other activities, he'll be facing serious charges. He has connections, Fiona warned, people who owe him favors. Had connections, Harrison corrected. Amazing how quickly rats abandon a sinking ship. Once word got out we were investigating him, people couldn't talk fast enough. As night fell, arrangements were made to transport the prisoners to Laramie the following day. Burke volunteered to ride with the marshal, leaving Jackson and Fiona alone in the cabin that had so recently been a battlefield. I thought I'd lost you, Jackson said quietly as they sat by the fire, his arm around her shoulders. When Burke told me Taylor's men were heading this way, I was so afraid, Fiona admitted. Not just for myself, but for you. They said Frank would see you hang. Let him try? Jackson's arm tightened around her. I'd face 100 Frank Taylors to keep you safe. The simple declaration broke something open in Fiona's heart. Tears she'd been holding back spilled freely down her cheeks. I never thought I'd find this again, she whispered. Safety, trust. Love? Jackson asked softly, the word hanging between them. Fiona looked up at him, seeing in his eyes the same emotion that had been growing in her heart for months. Yes, she said. Love. He kissed her then, a kiss that held both tenderness and passion, promise and fulfillment. When they finally parted, both breathless, Jackson touched her face with reverent fingers. "Stay," he said simply. "Not as my hired help, not as someone hiding, just stay." "Are you asking me to marry you, Jackson Mitchell?" Fiona asked, a smile tugging at her lips despite the day's trauma. "Doing a poor job of it, aren't I?" He laughed softly. "Yes, Fiona Taylor. I'm asking you to be my wife, to help me build something here, something good." "Yes," she answered without hesitation. "Yes." The following weeks brought profound changes. Frank Taylor was arrested and charged with multiple crimes, his carefully constructed facade of respectability crumbling under the weight of evidence against him. When offered the chance to divorce him, Fiona seized it, reclaiming her independence legally as well as emotionally. Word spread quickly through the scattered community. Some disapproved of how quickly Fiona moved from one marriage to another, but most understood the circumstances were far from ordinary. They were married in late April, when the land was coming alive with new growth. The ceremony took place on their ranch, for Fiona already thought of it as theirs, with only a few witnesses: Thomas Burke and his young son, Mrs. Winters from the general store, and Marshall Harrison, who had returned to deliver the news that Frank Taylor had been sentenced to 15 years in territorial prison. "He won't trouble you again," Harrison assured Fiona as he prepared to leave after the simple ceremony and celebration. "And if he ever tries, you have friends now." Looking around at the small gathering at Jackson, talking earnestly with Burke, at Mrs. Winters fussing over the wedding cake she'd insisted on baking, Fiona felt a sense of belonging she'd thought forever lost. "Yes," she agreed, "I do." That night, as they stood together on the porch of their cabin, watching stars appear in the vast Wyoming sky, Jackson wrapped his arms around her from behind. "Happy?" he asked, his breath warm against her ear. Fiona leaned back into his embrace, covering his hands with hers. "More than I ever thought possible." "Good," he said, turning her to face him. "Because I plan to spend the rest of my life making you even happier." "Is that a promise, Mr. Mitchell?" she asked, reaching up to trace the smile lines that had deepened around his eyes over the months she'd known him. "It is, Mrs. Mitchell," he replied, bending to seal the vow with a kiss. As summer settled over the land, the ranch flourished under their combined care. Jackson's plans to expand the cabin materialized into action: a new bedroom, a proper kitchen, even a small parlor where Fiona established a modest library, ordering books from as far away as Chicago. Jackson's artistic talents found new expression as well. Encouraged by Fiona, he began sketching more regularly, eventually graduating to paintings that captured the wild beauty of their home. When Mrs. Winters offered to display a few in her store, they sold surprisingly well to travelers passing through Willow Creek. "Could make a business of it," Fiona suggested, as they counted the unexpected income from his third sold painting. "Not to replace ranching, but alongside it." "Maybe," Jackson agreed, though he seemed more pleased by her pride in his work than the money it brought. "Never thought anyone would want my scribblings." "They're not scribblings," she corrected firmly. "They're art. And they let people see this place through your eyes." By autumn, their ranch had gained a reputation beyond the immediate area. Jackson's careful management of the cattle herd and Fiona's successful experiments with crops not typically grown in the territory attracted attention from other settlers looking to diversify. They hired help for the first time that fall: two brothers from a failing farm to the east, who proved to be hard workers and respectful of the unusual partnership between Jackson and Fiona. With extra hands, they were able to increase their cattle operation and begin planning for the following year. It was on the first anniversary of Fiona's arrival at the ranch that Jackson surprised her with his most meaningful gift yet. After dinner, he handed her a small package wrapped in brown paper. "What's this?" she asked, turning it over in her hands. "Open it and see," he urged, uncharacteristic nervousness in his voice. Inside the package was a deed, the official paper transferring ownership of the ranch to both of their names jointly. "Jackson," she breathed, understanding the significance of the gesture. "You didn't have to do this." "Wanted to," he said simply. "It's as much your place as mine now. Has been since you planted that garden and named every one of the chickens." Fiona laughed through the tears that threatened. "They have distinct personalities," she defended, especially Gertrude. The ornery one that pecks everyone but you? Can't imagine why I remember her. His smile faded into seriousness. This is real, Fiona. This life we're building. I want you to know that no matter what happens, you'll never be without a home again. The word home resonated deeply with Fiona. Not just a place of shelter, but of safety, of belonging. Something she had searched for all her life without realizing it. I love you, Jackson Mitchell, she said, wrapping her arms around his neck. More than I have words to express. Show me, he whispered against her lips, and she did, with all the passion and tenderness that had grown between them over their months together. Later that night, lying in each other's arms, they spoke of the future of children they hoped for, of expanding the ranch, of the community they were slowly becoming part of. Dreams that once would have seemed impossible to Fiona now felt not just possible, but inevitable. Do you ever think about how different our lives might have been? She asked, her head resting on his chest. If I hadn't run that night, if I hadn't found your barn. Jackson was quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. Don't like to think about it, he admitted finally. The idea of never knowing you. He shook his head. Some things are meant to be, I reckon, even if the path getting there isn't what we would have chosen. Fiona thought of all the pain and fear that had led her to this moment, to this man, this home, this life. Worth it, she said softly. Every step. As they drifted towards sleep, Fiona's last conscious thought was of the frightened woman who had stumbled into Jackson's barn a year ago, desperate for shelter. She wished she could tell that woman what lay ahead, not just safety from the storm, but a love that would heal her wounds and help her rebuild her life into something stronger and more beautiful than before. Outside, a spring rain began to fall, pattering gently on the roof of the cabin they had transformed into a home. Inside, sheltered in each other's arms, Jackson and Fiona Mitchell slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that, whatever storms the future might bring, they would weather them together.